Good evening, comrades, and welcome to the second part of our session on Stalinism, the debate on Stalinism with Hillel Tickin. So I'd like to welcome Hillel and everybody who's now joining us. Obviously, as we said last week, and as was developed in the discussion, Stalinism, its nature and its impact on world politics and on the labor movement is obviously a very important topic. And I think that last week we had a very interesting discussion in which comrades asked plenty of good questions and made contributions. So I hope that we can repeat that this week. Before I begin, a couple of points. If you want to ask a question, then either use the raise hand or the question and answer box. If you've got technical problems and you can't raise hand, use the raise hand function, or there are other reasons why you can't appear on the screen, then I will ask the question on your behalf. But it's obviously much better if comrades can come in and put the questions to Hillel or make a comment. In order to ensure that everybody gets a sort of fair crack of the whip, I'm going to ask Hillel to respond to each question or comment individually, and that would then allow people to really consider what's being said. So without much further introduction from me, I'll hand over to Hillel, and we'll hear his introduction, and then we'll move on to questions and discussion. Okay, Hillel?
Okay, thank you. Last time we ended up just leaving the 1934 17th Party Congress. Officially, of course, what happened was that Stalin won, got what he wanted, and then at the end of the year, he killed Kirov. Well, Sergei Kirov, if one looks him up, I got an article arguing that he was a close friend of Stalin. Now, officially, of course, somebody either killed him, somebody else killed him. But one would have to be very naive to actually believe it, since nobody can, at the present time, prove exactly that it was Stalin, or at would appear any time was able to prove that it was Stalin. The textbooks usually simply refer to the assassination by somebody who otherwise was unknown of Kirov. But it would really be some kind of attempt to be a superhero, to really claim that Stalin didn't know anything about it, it just happened. And the fact that Kirov was critical of him, even if he was declared to be a close friend, was a coincidence. The fact was that at the 17th Party Congress, Kirov got a fair number of votes. There was actually a vote for various posts. And officially, Stalin was elected. I'm not really clear whether that statement is true. At one point, actually, when I was in the Soviet Union, I discussed it with a number of Russian friends. And I think there was a feeling that there was a good chance that, in fact, Stalin was in a position where he might not have been elected, or maybe he wasn't even elected, but the votes showed that he was elected. Well, that's the way it seems, and of course it's perfectly possible, since we don't have any proof of what I've just said, that Stalin was indeed elected. However, what I've brought out, it was the ambiguity of many, I don't know if it was the majority, but very probably was a majority of the voting members. at the time at this conference. Stalin had not played the same role that he did after this in the period 1931 to 3, leading up to this. He'd taken a step backwards, even though he remained the general secretary, he was in charge, and et cetera, et cetera. Of course, in this period, at least 8 million people were killed effectively in the collectivization process. Of course, when I say killed, it didn't mean they were killed only when they stood for their farm, as it were, but killed in the whole process of sending in troops and accusing people of various so-called crimes. Obviously, the period from 1929 onwards, with collectivization and at the same time the building of industry, was a crucial period of the Soviet Union. And of course, it's quite a statement to talk of the Soviet Union being industrialized in this period. They reached the third five-year plan by the time the war broke out. It's quite a statement today when we know the Soviet Union has been deindustrialized after the changeover at the end of 1951. 1991, in December 1991. Today, Russia today is largely dependent on oil. At any rate, the point is that what was now occurring was a changeover of the society to a society more based on industry and less based on farming, where millions were killed trying to protect their ownership of farms, or working in the farms, or simply because they weren't reliable enough. The total figures are themselves probably dubious, although there's been considerable research done. It's certainly a very large number, and if one adds together the numbers killed throughout the former Soviet Union, could well be considerably more. So what now occurred effectively was a complete control, of course, of the collective farms and the sovkhozy as well, so that the farming sector, which had 80% of the population before 1917, obviously went down in numbers, and considerable numbers came to towns, and the towns were built up. So from 1934 onwards, we get Stalin stepping in effectively with direct control. In 1935, he arrests Zinoviev. Amazingly, he was still alive after all that. Zinoviev, who had been with Lenin for many years, of course, doesn't seem to have had much, I don't know what the word is really, courage or much ability to stand up for himself. He confessed time and again. And that was then a prelude to a series of trials. The trial of the Bukharists, I think that's 36 or 7, etc. The period when people were arrested and either jailed or directly hanged, killed, or however they were killed, officially the main period ended in 1939. But the society was completely changed. What one therefore had was a period of turning the society into a total dictatorship. The word total, of course, is used in this. That's to say, the word then applied was, and is applied, is totalitarian. When Trotsky was talking about it, I think at one point he did actually use the word. The question, of course, then arises as to what actually existed there and what continued to exist. The fact is they gave rise to a society where nobody could trust anybody else. And of course, it was class divided. That's to say, if you look at who was killed, a disproportionate number of intellectuals, educated people as opposed to workers who'd come from working in the fields, whose education was either non-existent or very, very, very limited. And in fact, if you actually look at who was killed, it was by far disproportionately of those who were not workers. If a worker did disobey orders, he could well be put into a camp. But the numbers were relatively limited, not that there were none, not that there were not thousands, but in comparison to the intelligentsia, it was much less. So the intelligentsia was therefore dealt with. The opposition effectively ceased to exist. Could only exist underground. But how would it ever exist underground? It would have been extremely difficult. It doesn't mean to say that some number of people survived or managed to escape. One would have thought with this situation where people were scared of being arrested and sent to the camps, and if you were sent to a camp, the chance of you surviving the camp were low, and people knew that. You would think that that was that, as it were, and nobody could have escaped it. I don't know how many people escaped it, but I knew somebody who did. And my first wife's grandfather was such a person. He was, in modern terms, you would be called a Trotskyist. I'm not clear what party he actually belonged to, but he certainly took a positive line to Trotsky. I met him, and he had gone underground effectively in the 30s. I'm not clear which year, but it may well have been before 36. You know, something like 34, 35, or whatever. But he didn't simply go underground. He had been jailed, no doubt as a Trotskyist or something like that. And he managed to escape the jail. Now, I'm making that point. Of course, I can make it now since everything doesn't exist. Otherwise, I would have kept quiet. But the fact that he escaped gives you an indication that he must have, that there was more people in society until fairly late on. I don't know when it stopped, who didn't like what was going on and were prepared to help those who had been victimized, because I don't know how he escaped from the jail, but he would have had to be helped out. And after that, he must have been covered for. I'm saying this because one must assume that some number of people, maybe it was quite a lot of people, managed to escape in this particular way. Now, what this really meant was there came into existence a society in which no one could trust anybody. Clearly, in the case I'm quoting, there was some trust. So particular sections or particular individuals who knew how to survive under these circumstances did survive. How many of that was, I don't know, and I'm sure there is no investigation of it. But it made for a society which is extremely difficult to live in, to put it mildly. I think the viewpoint I took when I lived there for almost 5 years was that, and I think most people whom I could speak to would agree with it, was that if there were 3 people, 1 person would probably inform. It might sound kind of extreme, but that's, I think, the actual reality. And they came into being in this period in order to maintain the society, a massive secret police whose job it was to get the information as to whom they reckoned they could trust and whom they couldn't trust. Well, clearly a society of that kind, you can't trust anybody, including the people in the secret police who are looking to find other people who are not trustworthy. The secret police itself would individuals in the secret police themselves would be dubious. So that what came into being was a society which very few people could ever examine, could ever have expected to come into existence, and quite obviously could not have lasted too long. That's to say, the Soviet Union under Stalinism could not have lasted much beyond the point when it did. And if one thinks about, of course, when Stalin came to an end, he was left lying unconscious next to his bed. If you remember this, the stories or the account of how he died, he apparently was lying unconscious next to his bed, and they didn't do anything about it until he died. That was in 1953. It's hardly surprising. But a society of that kind cannot, in fact, run an economy in an efficient way. Nobody trusts anybody. Workers in that society did their best to work as little as possible and get a job where their responsibility would be limited. Obviously, it meant that costs in the Soviet Union didn't compare with costs in a developed capitalist country. It meant that in a factory making whatever it was, the cost of the end product would be some multiple of what it might have been if it had been in the West. It meant also that it was difficult to introduce new inventions, new machinery, because people were not interested in learning how to make it work. So they learned, but it took a lot longer. So obviously it was more backward, and the results would be inferior. the statistics all showed that right down to the end. So it was inefficient in a way in which no capitalist country was inefficient. There was no solution to it within a Stalinist society of that kind, where you have whatever the number was in the secret police, over 1 million or maybe several million, in order to maintain the society in obedience within the norms of the that had come into being. Now, this came into being in the 30s and was enforced or reinforced by the purges themselves. You have to remember the purges continued, and that so much so that, of course, I think in 1948, Stalin jailed Molotov's wife. I think he gave her 8 years or something. And Molotov, although he's on the Politburo and was there when Stalin sentenced his wife, Molotov didn't do anything about it. That was the nature of the Soviet Union itself. Now, everybody who would be born into the system after 53, of course, obeyed the rules, not the what was directly written down, as it were, alone, of that society. Now, that came into being in the 30s. There really was no way out of that form, because either what they had was capitalism, which runs in a different way with money, capital, control over labor, with an incentive system. Either they had that and they didn't have that. And I have to say, although I've given an outline, which is very short, it stands in direct contrast to what some people think the Soviet Union was. That's a state capitalism. If you understand it in any sense capitalist, you don't understand it at all. What actually happened or why it happened. Obviously, the population in general was discontented. Obviously, they couldn't be anything else, given the situation they found themselves in. Of course, it was true that the intelligentsia has built up, those with higher education, and that was a relatively small percentage of the population. Obviously, in the 30s, and although it built up, it was still relatively small, very small. Could try and have an easier life, particularly if what they did was go work, let's say in Novosibirsk, where there was in fact quite a developed intellectual and industrial center. And in principle, it would be more difficult in the areas which were making, in the areas of the country which make the decisions. So, one way what happened could be put is that it wasn't capitalist, and it certainly wasn't socialist. There was no control from below, which is a minimum condition for socialism. It couldn't be controlled from below. So Stalin would not, and Stalinists would not accept it. So the only way they could go was step by step through various forms of control, which amounted to a form of total dictatorship in producing a world which did not exist anywhere else and no one could even dream of. In a feudal society, of course, because of the differences in time and space, effectively, as to say, a peasant who looks after cattle somewhere else looks after cattle somewhere else, and the control is limited. But in the case of a factory or a collective farm, etc., where there's control, it's very different. So this is the first time in history that you really get a full-scale dictatorial form, which nobody could ever have dreamed up. It isn't that Stalin dreamed it up, of course. He didn't think of what he was doing, but he wasn't going to go a socialist road. He wasn't going to go a capitalist road. So he just took what came up. And since there are no forms, there is no third way. He had to go for the only way which was possible, which was direct control. And the direct control required direct punishment if people didn't obey. And who on earth would want to obey under these conditions where the supply, not just of industrial goods, but the supply of food itself was short for a long time. Well, in fact, although certainly when I was in the Soviet Union, I had enough to eat, there were parts which didn't. And a proportion of the population had a limited diet. And if you look at the life expectation, it was relatively low compared to the West. And that wasn't really because of the absence of possibility had they had a structure with a genuine incentive system, but they didn't. That basically their incentive was, in the end, force. If you didn't obey, you would be punished. But clearly, after Stalin died, it changed. But that underlying principle, the dictatorial form remained. The secret police remained. They always knew what was happening. They may not have always intervened, and clearly it got easier in the 80s. But the point is that the form which was introduced in the 30s came into being because there was no other form between capitalism and socialism. Either you have the incentive using money, or you have incentive where there's direct interrelationship. You have a highly democratic form. There's no third way which can last other than a dictatorial form. And one of its features, and the feature of the Soviet Union to the end, was its supreme inefficiency. That's to say, whatever was produced cost a lot more than it would have under capitalism, even under capitalism, even in a relatively non-advanced capitalism. Now, one didn't have to be a genius to see that this would be the result, in fact. If somebody had sat down, nobody did, of course, somebody had sat down and tried to work out what would result, they would have seen that it wasn't a viable solution. It would, in the end, be forced to choose. Of course, the end came and they did choose. The cost in numbers of lives killed, number of people who died overall has been assessed by different people in this period. In fact, I have Robert Conquest's book here, The Great Terror, in which he discusses it. He's had a later edition that I'm holding there. And it's a reasonable discussion of it. I think he came up, before he died, he came up with a figure of 12 million people died during this period. As I was saying, in principle, you had a higher proportion among the intelligentsia than among ordinary industrial workers. But obviously a considerable number died during the collectivization. And clearly that then affected the society, especially, of course, with the invasion of the Nazis. But that inefficiency remained in relation to the Nazis themselves. That's in the war. If you look at what actually happens and the discussion, I'm not supposed. I'm not going to go into it, but I'm making the point that the inefficiency, the inability to deal with the society, except through direct force, remained. And when the Nazis invaded, of course, the fact that he made a pact in the first place is pretty dubious. But when the Nazis broke the pact and marched on Moscow, Stalin went to bed. He couldn't cope with it. They managed to persuade him to come out of it. But the way they ran that war itself was one which a more democratic and more efficient, more someone who was more democratically orientated would have run very differently, and almost certainly the numbers who died would have been considerably less. Officially, they say 27 million people died in the war. Incidentally, when you talk of the numbers that died, the proportion of men to women was much higher, which is what you'd expect, of course. Given the fact that the soldiers were largely male, and given the fact that during the 30s, the people chosen were also tended to be those who were likely to cause, were regarded as likely to cause trouble, even if they weren't likely to cause any trouble. So anyway, the effect was there was a considerable disproportion between men and women after the war, after 45, which made it difficult for the society, not just because of Stalin, but because of the nature of society itself. It's one more problem for it. So what one had brought into being, as was in the 30s, was an individualization of the society, was a society where no one could trust anyone, and where the inefficiency was a necessary form which had come into existence. It could never have been changed as long as they maintained that particular system. And one should not regard that system as having anything whatsoever to do with socialism. It had nothing to do with socialism. Thank you.
Thank you, Hillel. Just remind comrades that if you want to ask a question, use the raise hand function or the question and answer box. First comrade to come in is Tony Greenstein. Just like to come in now, Tony.
Yeah. Hillel, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you well.
Okay, thank you. I'm just wondering whether during the war there was a change, at least to some extent, in what you say in terms of the control by violence and by force and by authority, and whether there was a greater degree of popular control. Because it's my impression that there probably was, albeit it is impressionistic, my views. Certainly, there was a greater degree of control, and if you like, democracy, amongst the partisans who were fighting in the field, in the forests of Belarusia and so on. Not least because the Stalinists could not exert central control. There had to be local initiative in order to survive. And I'm wondering whether that percolated through the system as a whole, as the population itself, if you like, resisted and rose up against the Hitlerites, despite Stalinism and despite the Stalinist control. I do know that Hitler and the Nazis underestimated the number of divisions that the Soviet Union could put into the field. They severely underestimated the resistance that they met. And I wonder if the fact that they were able to get so many people into the army and fighting was itself the product of changes within the Stalinist movement at that time. Just as a side question, really, you say Stalinism was nothing to do with socialism. That's true, but would you also accept that property was still collectivized and there was still the legacy of the Bolshevik era, so that although it wasn't socialism, it wasn't capitalist either? Whether you call it degenerated worker state or whatever, I think is really a question of names, but that's my input anyway.
Thanks, Tony. If you'd like to respond, Hillel.
Yes, yes, I understand the point. It's of course it's true that in order to fight the war, Stalin had to accept a measure of authority was going to go to his generals in the field. He couldn't order them at any one particular time, unless it was actually there himself, when he probably would, but he couldn't be. So there had to be a degree of decentralization. Yes, that's perfectly true. And the war was in effect a form in which the population did get a measure of control. That's true, which is what you're saying. Yes, that's true. It clearly did. And equally clearly, a substantial section of the population, I don't know how much actually, were against Hitler anyway. But that wasn't true of the Ukraine. You didn't mention Ukraine. But that wasn't true of the Ukraine. In the Ukraine, there was an opposition movement to the Soviet Union, to the Stalinist system, which was semi-fascist anyway. But it was a nationalist form which did support Hitler. So a section of the population, a nationalist section of the population, I don't know what the proportion is. I haven't investigated that. And certainly modern Ukrainian nationalist movements are not keen to go into it. But from my contacts that I've had, I get the impression that they do go soft on it. Anyway, the point is that I wouldn't say the same thing of the Ukrainian population. And I don't know what the attitude was of the various other national groupings. So I presume what you're doing is referring only to the Russian population. Yes, I think it would be true that in order they would have no choice. They would oppose Hitler coming in as a direct control. So yes, of course they have. There was a degree of loosening, if you can put it like that. Although, even so, the way he conducted the war was one which a superior, a less, what do you call him, dictatorial person with more understanding would have conducted far better. So fewer people would have died, and they might have been able to stop Hitler earlier. Remember, he did sack the main general involved. I've forgotten his name now, but who became the head of the army when Khrushchev took over in 1953. So it's not simple, but there is a point, of course, since large parts of the country as well were not necessarily directly held, as it were, by the Nazis, although they may have advanced further. You would get individual sections where a particular patrol or section of the army would be by itself, just trying to maintain itself. So it's a necessary feature, I suppose, of a war. Yeah.
Okay, Tony, come back for a quick response.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, I certainly think that the Soviet Union won despite, not because of Hitler. But in the case of Ukraine, from what I understand, it was, I think, the organization OUN, or the Ukrainian nationalists. Despite the collaboration with the Nazis, in the end, they came into confrontation with them. Stepan Bandera, I think, who was the commander, wasn't he?
Yes.
Jailed in Sachsenhausen. So, I mean, there were those conflicts because the Nazis basically treated the Ukrainians still as subhumans, and the oppression still continued. The Nazis were not going to arm, for example, Ukrainian detachments, although there was heavy collaboration. We know that. I mean, the guards of the concentration camps in the Warsaw Ghetto, I mean, were partly Ukrainian. But in terms of the population itself, it's difficult to know, but there was certainly resistance to what the Nazis did. I mean, certainly on the Jewish question, they weren't willing collaborators, the vast majority, nonetheless. But yes, of course, I mean, you're right. There was also hostility to the Soviet Union for it, given its record. Likewise in Poland, of course.
Yes, you said Bandera was jailed. He was, but he was also released by the Nazis.
Yes, the end he was, yes.
Okay, Matthew Jones next, comrade, please. Matthew Jones?
I can't actually see him. Can you see him?
No, he seems to have gone off.
Don't call him.
Yeah, and McShane next, comrade, then.
Okay, thanks, Hillel. So I just wanted to make a couple of points. Obviously, I agree with you on the nature of the society. Firstly, in relation to Kirov, I visited the Kirov House Museum, and obviously it's meant to be exactly as it was the day he left it, with the exception of this little, they've got this little museum about the famine at the time, and comparing the lifestyle he enjoyed compared to the lifestyle he enjoyed to the way the ordinary people in the streets and in the country were suffering. And and it, there are lots of photographs of him and Stalin, and there's lots of like hunting trophies and animal pelts and whatever. And you get the impression of Kirov as being more or less the same ilk as Stalin. That's how it came across to me, that perhaps not as clever, more friendly, hail fellow well met, but more or less the same kind of bureaucrat with the same kind of appetites, politically and physically. So, I mean, I think you're right. I think that he clearly was an opponent for Stalin and somebody he wanted to get rid of, and use the opportunity of getting rid of him in order to unleash the terror. But at the same time, if he wasn't going to be much different to Stalin if he had actually gained power. That's how it seems to me. And the second thing in relation to the war, I've been to Belarus, and my Russian teacher is from Belarus, and spoken to her family and mother and other people about the war, and visited the various monuments and museums. And what you get there, obviously Belarus was the point of entry for the Nazis, and it was the country which suffered the greatest losses as far as I know. And certainly there was an enormous amount of suffering. And I get the impression, okay, I know that there are the parades in Moscow and St. Petersburg and the patriotic nature of those, but I did just got the impression in Belarus, and to some extent also in Russia, of it just being enormous suffering. And that people, rather than necessarily being motivated to go out there and fight for this country, felt themselves to be in a position where they had no choice. And I think that there was very little trust in the regime, who I think people, to me it seemed, they just threw them at the German army. And then the final point is in relation to the purges itself. In my study of the Zhenotel, the women's section of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union Central Committee, it's very arbitrary who ends up in the camps, or who is killed and who survives. People who in the later years of 1920s were rebelling against Stalin, somehow some of them managed to survive, managed to sidestep. And then others who are really loyal defenders of, basically the Stalin project at the time of the first 5-year plan, they end up dead. So it often seems to me like, to be extremely arbitrary, to be, dependent on who you know and who you can get to kind of sideline you off into some library, or who you don't know. I mean, all of these people that I would have been looking at would be kind of, I suppose, intellectuals of a type insofar as they were the activists around the party. They were members of the working class insofar they weren't going to factories every day, but they were party workers. So it's just that when you said intelligentsia, my reading of that section of party activists was that they were party activists rather than members of the intelligentsia who'd managed to survive into that period. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Anne. Would you like to comment, Hillel?
Yes. Yes, well, regarding Kirov, it's clear that he was a Stalinist, as it were. But he did speak, well, insofar as one can read the stuff, and I'm not clear whether all the documents are around. But as far as one can see, Kirov was a bureaucrat, there's no question. But he did constitute an alternative to Stalin. The problem that someone who's in charge would have is whether there was actually a road along the way that Stalin was going. Stalin, remember, collectivized because the peasantry refused to go along with his line. The alternative could have been that he conceded to the peasantry up to a point. Or he could have taken the left opposition line, which after all, although it was left wing, the line that they should industrialize, which he did, but he did it in this you can only call awful way in which a large proportion was killed. Now, the problem for Stalin was that he couldn't maintain a dictatorial form without it going into what we're talking about. In other words, he either had to go the capitalist road or the socialist road. If he took a socialist road, he would get support of people who were on the left in general, and he could get support of some proportion of the working class and peasantry. He might have had to fight his way there, but he would also have the support of the army. But he didn't want to do that. Now, Trotsky could have taken power. He was offered it. And in any case, he had been in charge of the army. So he could have done that, but he didn't want to do it in an undemocratic way. You thought that Stalin could have gone the way of moving, as it were, towards capitalism. But what it seems to me that he didn't want to do that because he reckoned that his role would no longer exist. That's to say, he would have to devolve some measure of power to the capitalist, to a rising capitalist class, which is true. He didn't want to take that road. Clearly, if he had taken a socialist road by making it more democratic, he would have lost power immediately. So he had no choice, if he was going to maintain himself in power, but to go a road which doesn't exist. Because it doesn't exist, it can only do things which either in the beginning or the end or the middle, for that matter, don't work. And for whatever reason, whether Stalin was ill or loved himself so much, I don't know, but he didn't. He didn't want to take either way of moving, either a socialist road or a capitalist road. He could have tried either of them, but he didn't. He in order to maintain himself in power. It was therefore perfectly logical what he did, if at that kind of level. But what is not logical is the various steps that then go along with it, because there is no logic to it. It's not possible. You can't have a nothing, as it were. You can't have a non-policy. Something which inherently can't work, which no plan can actually produce. So he then took the extreme form of killing the people who stood in the way of wherever he was going. And Kirov, I don't know whether Stalin's description of him as a friend was true. I would doubt it. It doesn't seem to me that Stalin really trusted anybody. Mm-hmm. So I would assume that Kirov was being serious when he was making these proposals at the 17th Party Congress. Remember, at the time, Stalin had taken the day off, as it were, for a couple of years. He was still in power and issuing orders and so forth, but there was he was not ordering around in quite the same way. He was standing back a bit, and that's probably why the Congress took place in the first place, and why Kirov felt emboldened to be able to speak. I don't know why Stalin then, as it were, reversed the line and decided to be immediately active, maybe, I don't know. I mean, obviously, anybody who acts in this way must, in some sense, be ill. So they then decided that Kirov was somebody who would overthrow him, which is perfectly possible as well. Because Stalin's support, after all, on a theoretical basis, didn't exist. The peasantry clearly didn't support him, and no rational worker would support him either. So in terms of real support, he had very little, and he knew that. So he took the logical step of going point by point to a total dictatorial form which had never existed, and which could not exist in for a long time. Let's say forever.
Okay, Matthew Jones.
Oh, hi, comrades. Okay, sorry, my internet died, so I have to get back in here. I'm hoping that, the other thing about Stalin, of course, is the fact that actually he is, and of course the CP is responsible for preserving capitalism, and not just the dictatorial form within the Soviet Union and elsewhere, but also ensuring that capitalism continued. I mean, if you look at the actions from even 26 onwards, the terrible line they took in the general strike in Britain, supporting the TUC, the awful position they had in China, where they basically got the Chinese Communist Party massacred, and then followed, of course, by allowing the fascists to come to power in Germany, which should never have happened and wouldn't have happened except for the Stalinists. There's no question if Stalinism hadn't been there would be no fascism, because they, or certainly not in Germany anyway, because they just wouldn't. It was only the Stalinists that cleared the way for Hitler to come to power. I don't know whether that was, the question would be, okay, was it deliberate or just a matter of idiocy? In either case, there's no question that stands there. Spain, and then of course, worst of all, actually, of course, is that capitalism should, in logical terms, have been overthrown at the end of the Second World War when it was weak, and they understood this. I mean, the Americans were terrified in invading Europe that they wouldn't be able to control the France or Italy or these places, or Greece or whatever, and they wouldn't have been able to, except for the Stalinists. No question. I mean, the French resistance was tolerably reasonably armed, and certainly the south could stand off entire German divisions. In Italy, it was even more heavily armed, and they actually could have taken over the country with no particular issue. But for the CP, which actually held means we've got the horrible position we've got now. That Stalinism has been preserved. Stalinism has actually preserved capital beyond its sell-by date. Even when they invaded, as was pointed out by numbers of people, that when they invaded Eastern Europe in pursuit of the Nazis, actually what they did was they restored capitalism as they went along, or preserved capitalism as they went along. There wasn't an overthrow even to their own distorted version of life, until a year or two later. They were determined to hold capitalism in the structure that it existed. It's just extraordinary, but I suppose that sort of a condition of the poor political state of the workers' movement allied with that dictatorship, as Hillel puts forward, and I think that's the real basis of this is the fact that the thing actually leaves us in the position we are now, when we should have actually resolved this question two generations ago. Thanks.
Thanks, Matthew. Hillel?
Yes, well, of course, I agree in principle with what I agree in principle with what Matthew has said, although it would have been utopian to imagine something different once post-Stalinism was there. In the case of Germany, where we don't know what would have happened, it's perfectly true that the Stalinists actually formed coalitions in some of the German states with the Nazis, indicating where they were, as it were. That's true. And they had the idiotic line of after them, us. What existed in the Soviet Union wasn't socialist. So one can't say, can't talk of it reproducing something which was socialist somewhere else, since it wasn't socialist. But in general, I agree with what Matthew has said. Of course, Stalinism is responsible for the continuation of capitalism. But one other aspect of it, which I haven't touched on, or I mentioned perhaps once or twice before now, and that is we are not living in the same world as the 1920s. If you look at the degree of control of a central state, even though it's capitalist, it's considerably greater than it was. If you look at the nature of the firm today, it's a much, although it's a capitalist firm without question, but if you look at the way it's run, and it's a capitalist firm, but it's increasingly having to do it in a less individualist form. So what we're talking about is, as we said before, is a transitional period in which the different aspects of the global economy and the individual economies within that global economy are themselves changing. They're not socialist, but they're changing and limiting capitalism itself, providing, of course, a basis to overthrow the capitalism itself. But at the same time, capitalism as a form is changing away from itself. And that will continue. The only trouble is that, of course, from our point of view, we want it to happen not in another 100 years' time, but in 10 years' time.
Hillel, this is a question that's come in from in the question and answer box from Felicity Demota. And she says, wasn't the planned economy and collectivism a form of socialism, as were the dachas and the private plots a form of capitalism? So that's a question. And then she also adds, the Soviet technology in the space race and its industrialization couldn't really be called ignoring new technology. So those are her comments.
Okay, I'm not certain I remember everything, but it wasn't a planned economy, not in a real sense. If you look at the statistics, and then you discover that they declared that fulfilled the plan, like in the 30s, but they didn't. The statistics that we have today, that's to say, people who've gone over those figures, show that what they said was the result wasn't the result. They didn't fulfill it. They didn't actually get there. What they did was to declare a plan of X, Y, and Z, and then at the right time declare a new final result, which they of course reached because they discovered what the result was in time to be able to do that. So it's dubious whether you can call it plan. And one can go into the other aspects of it. When you have the workers not interested in working to a degree which had never existed under capitalism, what you get is a result which you don't expect either. You don't put in the plan that so much of it has to be discarded, or it has to last a lot, take much longer time, or you can't put in the new technique for whereas in the West they put it in 2 months, you require a year, etc. So the planning, it was nominal planning. It was a planning which wasn't real planning. You would never plan the way they planned. Nobody would want to plan the way they planned. That wasn't planning. So that wasn't an accident. It was because the workers didn't want to do anything, obviously. They didn't like the society, they didn't like the controls, they didn't like the way they were dealt with. And there was no incentive system. What were they going to give people when they just didn't have the wherewithal to give them? Where in parts of the country they didn't have enough to eat, even right to the end. It wasn't a planned system. I mean, that point I made quite early on when I came to when I was appointed a lecturer at Glasgow University. It was one of the main points I kept stressing, that it's a wrong term that to call it planned. It wasn't in the real sense of the word. What Soviet technology? Well, okay, they managed to get to the moon. Okay, they had aeroplanes, but the airplanes were, as you see, inferior, and it's not at all clear to me why they had to go to the moon. It's a waste of resources. It didn't exactly add anything for the ordinary population. Given that so many people and didn't really have a decent meal, you would have thought they could have concentrated on that. I think it's better. It would be better to say that it wasn't a planned economy, and I don't know any Soviet technology which was or substantial amount of Soviet technology which competes with the West. Look at the Soviet car. Who on earth would want the Soviet car? Okay, it's the East German car might not have been. It might have been worse. I don't know, but you'd have to be nuts to go and buy a Soviet car. I did actually have a discussion about Soviet cars with somebody who was selling them, who was ordering them from Soviet Union and selling them in Britain. And I said, "My God, what are you doing?" He said, "Yes, well, don't think we don't change the car. When we bring the car to Britain, we add all sorts of things to it so that it becomes okay." Well, that's the level of their technology. It doesn't mean, of course, that you couldn't be a scientist or a number of scientists and discover this, that, and the other. Of course they did. There was some level of that. Or I don't know why you'd call it Soviet technology. Yes, so in general, the Soviet Union was not really competitive in the world.
Okay, thanks, Hillel. Ian Drummond, next one, please.
All right, thank you. Well, first of all, I'd just like to say, obviously, that you can't take the truth value of a statement simply from, I think there might be some bad consequences if you believe this, and you might end up doing these naughty things, like the old idea about atheists being immoral, or even conversely religious people being fanatical or whatever. Either there is a God or there isn't. And I agree, you've made a very good point, Hillel, about the inefficiency of the coercion in the system and the secret police structure. That stood out at me in particular. But with those caveats, I must admit, I am going to ask now a question about the political consequences of leaving the Soviet Union to be a lower form of society than capitalism, because that's AWL's position on bureaucratic collectivism that they got from Schachtman. And it's led, I think, in a lot of ways to their general anti-imperialism that I think most people here would oppose. Of course, Schachtman broke with Trotsky on Finland in the midnight of the century when Stalin had just made his deal with Hitler, partitioned Poland, launched basically a war of aggression on Finland, albeit one that he justified as getting defensive positions against the invasion that came 18 months later. And so that was a hard question, and Trotsky was still saying at that point defense of the Soviet Union. But Schachtman ended up supporting the Vietnam War in the 60s. And also Bayard Rustin, a former civil rights leader alongside Dr. King, who was on a Schachtmanite line, ended up supporting apartheid South Africa against Cuba in Angola, as did from within the Stalinist camp Chairman Mao, on a similar, from a very different position, of course, with a similar obsession with Soviet imperialism. And Marx was right, I believe, to back Abraham Lincoln standing for capitalism against the slave system in America in the 1860s. And later on, I think anti-fascist wars can be justified even under capitalist leadership against a lower form of political organization, a much more dangerous and worse form than bourgeois democracy. But I wouldn't say that Cold War imperialism abroad and McCarthyism at home could ever be analogous to that. So I'd just like to tease out the question, I guess, of Stalinism as an international movement and of the kind of anti-Stalinism of the United States, which became a ruling class offensive at home and worldwide. And how do we answer the likes of the CPG, BML and all that? Not that I agree with them, I'd hasten to add very much that, but on the idea that these are all lies and slanders against the likes of Stalin. Because obviously a successful and genuine socialist leadership would face the same kind of things. The attacks didn't start on Stalin, but as soon as 1917 happened, and obviously the demonization of whether it's a trade union leader or a foreign leader who's not doing what imperialism says goes on into the present day. And people like Robert Conquest do seem to have quite a right-wing axe to grind as well that Hillel referred to. And also, was it actually a lower form overall of such a severe political expropriation of the working class? I couldn't see it as being the ruling class. It wasn't able to organize itself to rule in the way like the capitalists, for example, would in a capitalist society. But the material benefits, I think, were better than in comparable capitalist countries like Turkey or South America or wherever, or subsequently in the 1990s in the catastrophic collapse under Boris Yeltsin. And also things actually made it inefficient against the West in the competition of the Cold War. You could also argue were not signs of a lower society, but a higher one, like whether it's full employment or whether it's that the arms economy in the West seemed to always boost the economy, arms production, whereas in the communist societies it seemed to be a burden. So if Hillel has any explanation of that differential in the relationship to arms production. And finally, maybe a bit of a left field question, but obviously state atheism didn't just start with Stalin, and I'm wondering if that was some kind of, in some sense, prefiguration of the Stalinist repression that was to come. because it wasn't simply being a secular state getting out of religion. The Marxist government, of course, could be made up solely or at least overwhelmingly of atheist individuals. But when you were trying to convert the country on such a hot topic, then perhaps that would at least, I think, have led to alienation that was unnecessary and tangential to the main issues of the revolution in the population, and could have also perhaps been a prefiguration of the kind of ideological monolithic unity that came later on all questions under Stalin. And it's interesting that it was the most ultra-Orthodox Stalinism in Albania that was the only country that actually made religious belief a crime, whereas in Latin America, where liberation theology really took hold, might have the healthiest or certainly most successful left-wing movement in the current world. So I know that's quite a few different questions coming at a few different angles on the whole Soviet and Stalinist experience. That if Hillel could help with any of that, I'd be very grateful. Thanks.
Thanks
Well-
very much, Ian.
Well, I can't possibly cover everything, but firstly, I didn't say anything about state capitalism. I don't think it is state capitalist, and I don't think state capitalism is a useful term in relation to the Soviet Union or for any other country at the moment. So it's in fact, if you start to proceed along it, I agree with you, it's just wrong. The stuff I've read on understanding the Soviet Union by one-time Trotskyists, most of the time is nonsense or irrelevant. It's just not true. That doesn't mean to say that you might not want to apply it somewhere else, but I'm talking about the Soviet Union. I described it. If you want, I can go in greater detail. The ruling elite, there was a ruling elite, clearly. And if you want to call a state capitalist, then in my view, you'll make a mistake. It was a ruling elite, but it was limited in its control. That's the whole point. It wasn't a class. I don't define it as a class. It wasn't a class. Not only was it not a state, it wasn't a class. So it's nothing to do with state capitalism. Precisely because of the fact that what they had done was to go into a void, they ended up in a void. That's the point that I'm making, if one can understand it. They were not capitalist, quite clearly. Capital did not exist. On the other hand, quite clearly, there was a dictatorial form. And the relationship to the worker was one of direct control. One couldn't call it in any sense a movement to socialism. So it's neither capitalist nor socialist. Okay, so then you have to find a third term. I've just said it doesn't make sense to call it state capitalism. Okay, I don't have a word to one word that's involved. But what you had was a temporary phenomenon which came to an end because it had no way of continuing except by changing itself. And to revert to capitalism became apparently the only way forward, except they haven't even been able to do that to a degree which satisfies those who actually did it. But if it's not state capitalism, many of these other things that you're talking about don't apply. It's what exists. You could say isn't a higher form than capitalism, but it's not a lower form either. It's neither one thing nor the other in this respect. It doesn't help to say it's a higher or lower form. It's a form which has come into existence by overthrowing capitalism. That's what we know. Unless it proceeds from there to socialism, it must fall. Its only movement is towards socialism. The other most important thing is that what it did was to herald the movement away from capitalism. Remember, the Bolsheviks, then Trotsky and so forth, declared that they'd entered a transition period. That is where we are. It's not just Russia or China or Cuba, but every country in the world is now taking part and has taken part in this transition period. So that the forms are different from what they were 100 years ago. But in 1900, they didn't have proportionate taxation. They didn't have the tax system we have today, where everybody pays tax. Well, at the moment, of course, at the moment, it does seem a section of the capitalist class has managed to get away from paying any tax.
Maybe because of the fall of the Soviet Union and things moving to the right internationally. No, I didn't actually mention state capitalism. I think it's good to have that discussion too. I was more attacking the kind of Max Schachman AWL position of bureaucratic collectivism. And I think the difference is where state capitalism sees it as part of the capitalist system competing on the world market and kind of the same in a way. Neither Washington nor Moscow was the old slogan. The AWL Schachman position does see it as lower. Schachman ended up thinking that he was defending a higher form of society in South Vietnam from the depredations of North Vietnam by supporting the American imperialist intervention. So that's where he went with it, and that was the kind of political implications that I was worried about. I think that's interesting that you don't think it was lower. That's almost an irrelevant question. And the idea of opening up this transition period worldwide, I think, is a very interesting one. I think I heard in another talk you mentioned once that we didn't have democracy in these countries until after 1917. In terms of
we didn't have democracy. We didn't have democracy in this country until
yeah, exactly. I meant here, France, and so on. Yeah.
Okay, I've got a number of comrades who've asked questions in the question and answer box. So I'm going to just put a few of those to you, Hillel.
Right.
And we've probably got about another 2 or 3 comrades who want to speak. So I'll take them, and then we'll perhaps move towards a close. This is a question from John Gibson, and John talks about someone that he knew, and he says that this person had spent his early life as a child in the prison camps in Siberia, and he wants to know if you could talk a little more about who was in the prison camps and the Stalinist camps, and in particular, he's rather surprised that a child or indeed family groups might be in there. And then a question from Mary Lynham, and she says, do you think that it was correct for the Soviet Union to invade Finland and Poland in 1939? So those are 2 questions that have come in on the panel. I've got 2 others from that, but perhaps we'll just look at those 2 areas.
Sorry, what was the first question now?
The question was about the nature of the population in the Stalinist prison camps, particularly family groups.
Although I've actually been to Siberia, and I was actually taken to a former camp. The camp was no longer there. This is 1991. The camp was no longer there, but they showed me where it was and what was there. But I don't know what period you're talking about, because in the
well, I'll just finish.
I don't know exactly what period you're talking about, but people were taken to Siberia and made to work under conditions where within a short period they would die of inhaling the fumes. So that's what the lecturer who was showing us these places told us. So they would die perhaps a week or two later, or sometimes 3 months later. So I didn't know. Yeah, I knew they took underage people, but I didn't know they took whole families as well. Yeah, well, it's perfectly possible given what they were doing. I haven't investigated the exact detail, but there were certainly millions involved, so it's perfectly possible. Regarding the sorry?
No, it's okay, sorry.
Oh, Jesus, I can't read my own handwriting. Sorry, what was the second question?
It was on whether it was correct, was Stalin correct to invade Finland and Poland in 1939?
Well, one can't really put it outside of a context, but he was wrong to have done a deal with Hitler anyway. But in principle, I think a socialist government wouldn't have done that. Yes, what was the point? What's the point of invading at the time? It was a measure of defense, which I think any bourgeois government might have thought of, and certainly a society which claimed that it wasn't bourgeois, but was in defense of the working class, ought not to have done it. Yes, it didn't make sense. At the same time, I have to say, well, one can't support the Polish government of the time either. It was a pretty awful government. It was anti-Semitic, among other things. My father came from Poland, and that was certainly his impression of the country. But that doesn't mean to say they had to invade it.
Okay, Steve Freeman now next, please.
Thank you. There we go. I muted myself. Right, thank you, Hillel. I'd just like to go back, I suppose, to make some points. The first one being that the basic idea that you can't have socialism in one country. That seems to be a very important idea.
Yeah.
But the logic of that, of course, is if you can't have socialism in one country, it seems to me you can't abolish capitalism in one country. Because what is the abolition of capitalism in one country? The abolition of wage labor or wage slavery. And the only people who can abolish wage labor and wage slavery is the working class, because that's our basic theory of socialism. The working class is the only class that can actually do it. Now, somebody would have to say, well, if you think that capitalism was abolished in the USSR, well, when and how was it abolished, and who actually abolished it? And the answer is you don't really have an answer. You can say, well, Stalin did it, not the working class, but Stalin did it in 1926 or whatever. And the only argument one's got for that, saying that capitalism was abolished, is say that state ownership of the means of production is socialism. And many socialists do believe that. Once you've got state ownership of the means of production, that is by definition socialism. So when Stalin extended public ownership, he abolished capitalism. In my opinion, no, he didn't. And that's why I think the argument about state capitalism has got a lot more going for it. And even for things that you said, and if you compare the USSR with China and put them both in the picture, it's absolutely clear that in China, you've got a state-dominated form of capitalism. You've got the development of wage labor. You've got a mixed economy of private and state capital and multinational corporations. You've got a very, very competitive form of capitalism on a world scale, actually catching up with America. So the success of China, it only makes sense to China, is a form of state capitalism, a mixed economy, active in the world market, and actually being very, very successful. The difference between the USSR and China, by the way, then seems to me is that in the USSR, they introduced neoliberalism in the 1990s and completely fucked the whole thing over, whereas China never bothered to do that. They just carried on with their method and opened up the market to multinational corporations. And they are out competing America in the long run if they can. I mean, they're still behind America, don't get me wrong, but they are actually catching up. I mean, their progress of gathering massive amounts of capital and turning the Chinese peasantry into a proletariat. That's what they've done. They've industrialized that economy. It's been a massive change. So I think you can't really look at the Soviet Union in isolation from looking at what's happened in China. Now, the thing about the Soviet Union is you've got to separate out the political and the economic, because in the Soviet Union, you've got a political dictatorship. You've got a highly centralized bureaucracy. You've got secret police, you've got terror, you've got murder, you've got assassination, you've got slave camps.